Hey, what's up? My name is Husky, and I am a loser Pokemon Unite player who cares about this stuff. Sorry. And this is Wooper. Head pats for him. He doesn't care as much about this stuff as I do, but I care about this stuff. How about you? Well, if you're here watching, then you probably care at least a little bit. Today we're going to talk about Season 18 of Pokemon Unite's introduction to the draft mode for players with 1400 ELO and above, a mode that has a lot of people feeling some type of way. Now, keep this in mind. Again, I'm going to stress this. This video is recorded during Season 18 of Pokemon Unite, the first season in which draft has been introduced into the Master rank. So a lot of the information in this video, well, all of the information in this video is catered directly to the current state of Pokemon Unite. So if you happen to be watching this in the future, know that some of these points and some of the information I'm going to share with you might have changed. Now, you may love draft and you may hate draft, but we're going to talk about the facts of what it has done so far, what its future looks like, and the overall opinions of the player base. So Section 1. What does draft require a player to do? Now, I saw a video today of Draco-san going through how a draft is done, which I will link in the description of this video, and I'm not going to get into it too in-depth because he is doing that on his channel as well. So if you're interested in more content like this, go check out Draco's videos. Draft games are completely random, so as soon as you're above 1400 ELO, you could be queued into one at any time. Of course, solo queue drafts are rarer than a duo or trio draft, but it does happen sometimes, so it's important to be prepared for what position you're thrown into in the draft lobby. At the start of draft, teams go back and forth with 2 bans each. The bans are given to the last 2 players on each team, which means the lowest ranked in a fully solo queue match, but can also mean the 2 non-trio players, since trios are always put higher in the rank order in any given lobby. But each team will ban twice, then the pick phase starts. The first pick team, also the first ban team, will select 1 Pokemon, the second team selects 2, then 2 for the first team, 2 for the second team, 2 for the first team, and then 1 for the second team. So this is called a snake draft. During ban phase, players who aren't banning can request a ban to try to convince their team members to ban something, and then they can pre-pick their Pokemon, meaning your team can see that you want to play a specific Pokemon so they don't ban it. This is especially useful if you have first pick and pre-pick Mewtwo Y. So now if the enemy team doesn't ban Mewtwo Y, your team also knows not to ban it since you have it pre-picked, and you first pick the most broken, stupid, dumb. During the pick phase, players can switch the order of their pick with their teammates. For example, seeing that one of your teammates has first pick, but they would like to pick Delphox isn't really the best strategy, so you, as a tank player, can switch with them and first pick Umbreon instead, and then they can pick Delphox later, if it works for the team composition that your team's coming up with. After the ban and the pick phase, players have some time for last-minute preparations, including switching Pokemon with teammates last minute, changing their items, and calling their paths. Then, the game begins, and it's a normal, regular old game of Unite in the Thea Sky Ruins. So Section 2. Now we're going to be getting into more of the nitty-gritty of what I want to talk about in this video. This is the pros and cons section. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of drafts. Straightforward. Pro number 1. This makes the game more like a truly competitive MOBA. Pokemon Unite is a much less competitive MOBA than other games of this type, such as League of Legends, Dota, Smite, etc. Unite is generally easier and more accessible to the Pokemon fan base, but this also means that players don't have to be very good to reach high levels of play. Since draft requires players to understand the game on a deeper level, it makes it more competitive, hence encouraging players who are at high levels to learn the ins and outs of the game. Pro number 2. Certain non-meta Pokemon and items have a place in draft match. It's hard to know when Wigglytuff will be helpful in a game since Umbreon counters it extremely hard. If you're unfamiliar, Wigglytuff's Unite move gives massive shields to allies, and Umbreon's Unite move takes all of the shields away from enemies in the area around it. So basically, Wigglytuff is useless into an Umbreon who knows what they're doing. But seeing the enemy team has drafted a few brawlers like Buzzwole and Scizor without an Umbreon may be a great time to pick up Wigglytuff. Also, items like Curse Incense and Curse Bangle are only helpful if there are Pokemon on the enemy team who have a lot of self-sustain or healing. And Assault Vest is only helpful against special attackers. So being able to see what the enemy team has drafted can really bring these items and non-meta Pokemon up in value. Pro number 3. The highest ranked player on the team picks first, if it's fully solo. For this pro, let's say it is. This means that the player who likely knows what they're doing the most has the opportunity to lead the draft. This can be really valuable to give the team an advantage in drafting and try to push the team in the right direction. Now, let's get into our cons. Con number 1. We're going to go back to our first pro to address this con. So draft requires players to understand the game on a deeper level, which seems good. However, we have noticed that the player base of this particular game is kinda awful. So far, players have refused to do this. They don't understand the game at all. We're not ready for draft. This means, basically, that the players who actually know how to play a draft game are constantly having to fill positions and pick counters for the enemy team to make up for bad teammates who still insist on playing their one trick. The one trick Zeraora on your team will still pick Zeraora regardless of what the team needs. Con number 2. Players do not understand counters. So I touched on this during Pro 2 as a pro for non-meta Pokemon and non-meta items to come back into the meta, and I'm realizing all my cons just directly oppose my pro list, but stay with me here. So the player base doesn't have a single clue how to observe the picks of both teams and make decisions that will help the team. They will actively choose to pick Lane Greninja even after your team has drafted Dragapult and the enemy team has drafted Inteleon. Players assume that if they play well, they will win the game. And sometimes that can happen, but generally in a draft environment, that is just not the case. So con number 3. The highest ranked player on the team picks first. I said this was pro number 3. It is also con number 3. I said earlier that the actual good players on the team are more likely to have to fill slots, which holds true for this point. It's usually best in a blind pick game to try to carry the game if you notice you're the highest ranked player on the team, which is just not the best draft strategy. Now, there are more pros and more cons, of course, but we can sum everything I just said up in the following statement. Draft is great because it requires players to make competitive decisions and play the game optimally, but the Pokemon Unite player base is generally so bad that they will continue to ruin your games the exact same way they were doing pre-draft. Now, section 3. The question I'm going to answer in this section is, why is draft even that different than a normal blind pick game? In a blind pick game, you can go in with a horrible team comp and still win, so why is it so different? Well, truthfully, it's not. Even given the pros and cons that I discussed, it's still the same player base with generally minimal game knowledge, so even if your draft sucks, your team can still win the game. You can still just pick whatever you want regardless of the format of the game and end up on top. However, being able to see the other team's picks and actively make decisions that will give your team an advantage is valuable enough that draft is an entirely different game. It's much easier to shrug and choose a 5th attacker in a blind pick game because you have the excuse of not knowing what the enemy team looks like. They may have 5 attackers too, or 5 Pokemon that your attacker team counters really well. Sometimes the game is already decided just from the composition, so you can truly give your team a huge advantage just by drafting well. Now that's why we're seeing players in draft games suddenly abandon what they planned to do before the game to make sure they're drafting properly. I, for example, have been grinding hard for my Meowscarada blue ribbon, so I commonly insta-lock jungle in a blind pick game. I know it might be toxic, but I'm the toxic first immediate jungle calling speedster player. However, in draft, it's much better to pick my jungler later in the lineup, unless something's super broken, I'll get to that, so that I can see what I'm playing into. Unless, again, it's like Mewtwo Y or something like that. So if I'm first picking, it's much better that I grab whatever the most broken thing that didn't get banned is, or try to switch with someone else if I still want to end up picking the jungling Pokemon that I wanted to play. So section 4. In this section, we're going to be talking about draft strategies. Now, I'm not going to be covering every single strategy, and you might have different strategies. Please enlighten me with them. I would love to hear about what your strategies are and what you think of the ones that I have come up with. So strategy number 1, pick your tank or support early unless there's a super broken mon on the table. It's much better to have your frontliners on the board early because generally they don't get countered as hard. For example, a Slowbro Unite move can't really be countered, so even if your team figures out a way around the Surf and Telekinesis, someone on their team will still get shut down regardless. Also, there are only a few viable healers, so choosing your healer first takes it off the table for the other team. Strategy number 2. Pay attention to how the other team is picking. I know I just said to pick your tank and support early, but if you notice that after your team first picks Buzzwole, because it's broken, and if it didn't get banned, you should probably pick it. The enemy team selects Trevenant and Clefable. Now you know that this is likely going to be their tank and support, which means your team can focus on drafting other powerful mons you don't want to see on the enemy team, rather than worrying about choosing a tank and support. Now you can choose Glaceon, knowing it can rip through objectives fast and take it off the table for the enemies. You can always choose your tank and support later, since their team probably won't pick Blissey and Slowbro since they already have those roles filled. Strategy number 3. You see that your first pick player is going to select a jungler or a bottom lane attacker early in the draft, but there are broken mons that you don't want the enemy team to have, offer to switch with them. They won't always do it, but if you can play Clefable and the enemy team doesn't yet have a healer, switching with your teammate who wants to carry is honestly the best case scenario. Strategy number 4, have a wide mon pool. It's important that you know how to play at least one Pokemon from every role so you can better understand how you can help your team. Seeing that your team needs a healer but being unable to fill one, and that could be the difference maker in a draft match. Basically, I'm saying you can't one-trick anymore. Seriously, it's time to do literally anything else besides play Decidueye. You know who you are. Strategy number 5. Understand what a good team comp looks like. I know I said to have at least one Pokemon of each role on your roster, but there's more than that, especially because some Pokemon are categorized under one role but fill a different role. I'm looking at you, Mr. Mime. As a rule of thumb, try to pay attention to these key aspects on your team. Number 1, frontline. Does your team have a close range fighter that can stand in front of your squishies? This is often your tank, but can also be your tanky all-rounder that brawls and allows your squishies to fire more damage without being touched. Number 2, healing. Does your team have something that heals allies? This is often the game changer because not dying is generally a good way to win the game. That's why Pokemon like Clefable are so powerful, because the difference between having a healer and not having a healer is the difference between winning the game and not winning the game. Number 3, range. Being a full melee team is often detrimental since everyone on your team is diving with nobody to back them up. Having at least one ranged Pokemon allows them to position behind the rest of the team and rain in damage without the enemy team being able to reach. Number 4, secure. Can your team secure objectives? Do you have a strong burst move or unite move on your team that will allow you to prevent the enemy team from taking away objectives? Having a strong secure move often means you force the enemy team into a team fight rather than allowing them to take Rayquaza without having to even fight you. Plus, if you have good secure and the enemy team doesn't, flipping an objective can be an option that keeps your team ahead or brings them back into the match. Number 5, rip. Can your team do good damage to the objectives to set up your secure Pokemon to secure it? Can your team burn through Rayquaza fast if you notice the enemies are dead with 5 seconds left on their timer? Having one Pokemon that can rip objectives is often pretty important. Alright, so in this next section, I'm going to give you some tier lists of each of the different roles in Pokemon Unite draft and how their priority shakes out within the pick phase of draft games. And again, disclaimer, this is all just my opinion and my personal experience. Feel free to weigh in as well with your opinions. So this tier list right here, this is the tank tier list. So I've broken it up into the highest priority, prioritize, still, situationally, can be good, and don't pick this. So these are just for tank Pokemon. So I've put all Pokemon that I would consider to be useful as a tank in the current draft mode. Now there are some arguments for other Pokemon to be included on the tank list. You know, there's some all-rounders that can be potentially tanks, such as Buzzwole, or, you know, Metagross can be used as a tank. But generally, this is what you're going to be looking at in a ranked ladder draft game of Pokemon Unite. So what I want to point out here is that the highest priorities currently in the game are likely to be Umbreon and Blastoise, and also really high priorities are Crustle and Trevenant. These are the 4 tanks that are probably most often used within your draft games and ranked in general. They're all very, very strong for their own reasons and are very beneficial. If not banned, someone on your team should definitely try to grab one of these 4. Now, that doesn't count out the situational picks either, because many of these are good in different situations. Slowbro can be picked up kind of at any time. Mime counters a lot of things in the meta. Goodra's a fun pick that a lot of people just really enjoy. Mamo's pretty good right now as well. So situational picks can also be very good. And don't play Greedent as a tank. This thing is not a tank. I don't even know what to call it. It's probably a top laner, honestly. So this is the support or healer tier list for drafting. There's not many healers that can be picked currently. There's not a lot of support Pokemon in general, but there are a few healers that are important to point out here. And I've put everything from the support role in here just so that we could talk about it a little bit. But generally, your highest priority healers are going to be your Clefable and your Blissey. This does the most healing. And now, not to say that you shouldn't also prioritize your Eldegoss, your Hoopa, your Wish, Umbreon. These are also very high priority healers. But the difference maker in high healing numbers is sometimes really important for winning a game as well. All of these 5 Pokemon in the highest priority and prioritize this tier are used a ton. There is at least one of them in every single draft game competitively, and should be in every single draft game on Ranked Ladder as well. Now, situationally, you can still run Wigglytuff. It doesn't have healing, but it can still be run as a support in case you don't want to run a healer. Mr. Mime with Guard Swap can be run in some circumstances as a healer. Comfey, if you have certain Pokemon that Comfey does really well with. Sableye is not a healer. Do not pick it as a healer. Again, like Greedent, it doesn't even really fit a role. Just don't play that thing. Next up, we have our bottom lane attackers. This is just what the role is generally called. You send a tanker support and an attacker of some kind into the bottom lane. Generally, that's the meta that has been figured out, but it also doesn't mean that all of these Pokemon are necessarily attacker Pokemon. So, highest priority here, you see Mewtwo-Y, you see Miraidon. If these aren't banned out, pick them anywhere as a high priority. Also, Inteleon and Espeon are both really strong picks right now. They are usually either picked or banned. Inteleon actually has seen a little bit of a fall off recently since Snipe Shot has been nerfed, but its secure is still incredible and should generally be prioritized. My hot take of what I think is a hot take is that Pikachu is really, really good and should be prioritized more in as a bot attacker role, or even, you know, potentially as a support type attacker. Leafeon is either picked or banned. Meowscarada, we've seen it rise incredibly over the past couple weeks, especially in competitive play, but it got a battle pass, so many people are playing Meowscarada. Mew, still very, very strong. Venusaur with Solar Beam, also very, very strong and has really strong secure. Now, everything in this situational pick tier, it all depends on what the other team is picking. So, as I said earlier in the video, it's important to pay attention to what your team's picking and try to counter their picks with yours. So a lot of times that means picking these attackers later on in the draft. But again, if Mewtwo-Y or Miraidon isn't banned, someone should pick it up early, even though it does fill an attacker role and can somewhat be countered. It is still insane and broken and could be, you know, pick it if you can. And again, for the bottom lane specific attacker role, picking these auto attackers, Cinderace, Dragapult, and Duraludon that need a lot of experience early are really difficult to kind of play against. These should be put into the jungle. I'm not saying don't play it at all, because they're still fairly strong Pokemon, but playing auto attackers in path can be much more difficult to get online early. So generally, try to keep them to the jungle role. Next up, let's look at our top path tier list. So like the bottom attacker role, usually you will have a support or defender with EXP share heading to the top path with something that stacks and tries to do a lot of damage, usually a brawler, something melee that gets up in the face of the enemies and is able to secure a lot of KOs and get as many stacks as they can in the early game. So of course, your highest priority, Buzzwole. If the thing is not banned, someone better pick it. I hate that thing so much. But it is a very, very high priority as a top path Pokemon. Blastoise as well, even though it's also high on the tank roll, Blastoise can flex into a top path Pokemon really well. It has great early game secure, it stacks really well with special attack specs, and it can really also carry games as well as it can defend them. Now as well, focusing on top path Pokemon still, you have Zacian, Lucario, Leafeon, and Mewtwo X as well. Leafeon, again, is seen on this tier list because Leafeon can also flex to kind of play anything. It stacks easily, evolves early, can get online, and have insane secure and just run around the map and be as annoying as possible. I put Zacian and Mewtwo X on here as well. EX Pokemon, they can both be prioritized and kind of flex to multiple different positions, but again, they fill that top path role really well. Now, situational picks, the top lane is very flexible. You can run a lot of different all-rounders here, you can run some defenders here, you can run some speedsters here in the top path position. It just depends on what your team comp looks like and what you think is going to be best suited against what the enemy team has as well. Now, it's important again to also put some other all-rounders that don't really work super well as top path Pokemon. These are Charizard, both of the Urshifus. Sable, I just don't pick at all. He's also here for some reason, just because I want to stress to you not to pick it. And Dragonite. And that's not because these Pokemon are bad and can't be played at all. It's just because they require a lot of experience, they don't have great secure, and they're much better for the jungle role. Finally, our last tier list, let's take a look at our jungle role draft. So a lot of different Pokemon can go into your jungle. It can be speedsters, attackers, all-rounders, but here we have Leafeon and Glaceon being placed into the highest priority. Generally, these Pokemon are pretty broken and are either picked or banned every game. Leafeon's been on 3 tier lists of these because Leafeon should be played and it can be played pretty much anywhere. Again, priorities can also include both of the Mewtwo's, Miraidons, Zacian, all the EX Pokemon can be played in jungle. Espeon as well, though it is a bot path attacker generally, it can also jungle really well with stored power. Inteleon, getting your snipe shot early can also be really helpful. Meowscarada seeing a huge surgence in being picked early, and I personally think it's one of the best junglers in the game right now. Now again, we have a bunch of situational picks here that should generally be played in the jungle, but aren't necessarily the meta and don't need to be prioritized. Instead, you should wait to see what the enemy team is picking and then choose your jungler based on that. So a good example, again, I had Cinderace in the bot path tier list as not to choose, but Cinderace can be a really, really good jungler into a lot of different enemy team compositions. So situationally, picking Cinderace in late in your team's draft and then jungling with it can be very helpful for your team. You can end up pulling a lot of wins out by choosing some of these situational picks after you see what the enemy team is trying to do with their composition. And of course, the don't pick this tier, this doesn't mean don't pick this at all. This is just some of our attackers and all-rounders that really shouldn't be played in the jungle, either because they need stacks early or they just have such a bad clear that they really shouldn't be played in the jungle, or they have a really solid laning phase that's best suited for lane, like Alolan Ninetales and Pikachu, for example. And I have Water Bear on there as well, because though it should be played in the jungle if it's going to be played at all, it is just not very good right now at all. So, unfortunately, he is down there. So that's it. That's the current draft breakdown from my perspective. And honestly, I don't really have a conclusion about it. I can hope that the developers recognize the lack of competitive play in ranked and encourage their players to quite literally get good so that draft becomes a more enjoyable experience for everyone. But, you know, I still love the game, and I play this game a lot. I get excited when I get a draft game, even though sometimes I do just want to insta-lock my Drungle Meowscarada and not think much about it. So let me know your thoughts. Let me know how much you disagree with the tier list that I just presented to you. And please feel free to provide your insights, your strategies, your feedback, and let me know what you think about draft. Do you like draft? Do you hate draft? Let me know. And I'll see you later.